Church, a relationship of ministry to others, part 4. We've seen so far, of course, that church is a special place of ministry to others. It gives us that opportunity, that privilege. The foundation of that is loving one another as Christ hath loved us, and also Matthew 7, verse 12, treat others as we would want to be treated. In order to minister to one another, we have to be willing to put ourselves in a position to minister. We have to be willing to invest some time, some resources. And we've been looking at the phrase one another and what comes before that phrase to define our ministry to one another. Last week we closed with edify one another. So we'd like to go to Romans 15, and again we'll be looking at a lot of verses. Romans 15. Verse 14, and also if you turn over to Colossians chapter 3. Romans 15:14, and I myself also am persuaded of you, my brethren, that ye also are full of goodness, filled with all knowledge, able also to admonish one another. Admonish one another. Now keep a mark there and go to Colossians chapter 3, verse 16. Let the word of Christ dwell in you richly in all wisdom, teaching and admonishing one another in psalms and hymns and spiritual songs, singing grace in your hearts to the Lord. This admonishing conveys the idea of reminding one another of duty, reminding one another of behavior, becoming of a child of God. It includes several things. It would include warning one another. It would include rebuking one another, reproving one another, advising one another. And it is to proceed, again, from a love to one another and a deep concern for one's spiritual well-being. Now, the thing with admonishing is we must not confuse the spirit of admonition with the spirit of criticism. There are people who just have a critical spirit about them. That's not what this is talking about. So what is the qualification of the admonisher? If we are to admonish one another, then we must be qualified to do so. Now, if we go back to Romans 15, and again verse 14, he says that he was persuaded that they were full of goodness, filled with all knowledge, able also to admonish one another. So here's the qualification: goodness, knowledge. You have to have those two things. Goodness, that is your motive is good, and you have to have knowledge, wisdom. Notice that this makes us, Romans 15:14, makes us able to admonish. There are people who are not able to admonish because they don't live right, because they're not what they ought to be, because they do the wrong things. But we see Paul here is persuaded that these were people who were filled with goodness, filled with knowledge, and therefore able to admonish one another. Now, if we go back over to Colossians chapter 3, we see some other qualifications. Verse 15 and 16. Let the peace of God rule in your hearts. Let the word of Christ dwell in you richly in all wisdom. This is necessary. This is connected to admonishing one another. Now, this wisdom would include when to admonish, how to admonish. Notice Proverbs 25. And keep a mark there in Colossians, but in Proverbs 25, verse 11. A word fitly, properly spoken is like apples of gold in pictures of silver. Has an earring of gold and an ornament of fine gold, so is a wise reprover. Again, part of admonishment is reproving upon an obedient ear. For admonishment to be effective, for reproof to be effective, the reprover or the admonisher must be qualified, and the one being admonished must listen. Usually you don't have those two things together. There's a breakdown somewhere. But this is part of ministry. Admonish one another. Now notice, if we go back to Colossians 3, the means of admonishing is to be spiritual in nature. Colossians 3, verse 16, let the word of Christ dwell in you richly in all wisdom, teaching and admonishing one another in psalms and hymns and spiritual songs. So the admonishment is to be spiritual in nature. The goal of admonishing is spiritual restoration. Notice in Galatians chapter 6, Galatians 6, verse 1. Brethren, if a man be overtaken in a fault. Now it doesn't say if a man has a fault. That's not what it says. It says if a man be overtaken in a fault. That is, this fault has consumed them. This fault is about to destroy their lives. Ye which are spiritual, there's a qualification. Ye which are spiritual, not just anybody. Ye which are spiritual, restore such a one in spirit of meekness, considering thyself, lest thou also be tempted. So to admonish one another is to look out for one another. That's in all realms, physically, mentally, emotionally, most importantly, spiritually. To be a member of the body of Christ puts us in a position to be looked after. Don't get mad, don't get upset when a church member looks after you. That's what they're supposed to do. You ought to want them to do that. You ought to do that. So it gives us the privilege of, and puts us in a position of being looked after by people who care. Notice in 1 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 25. 1 Corinthians 12, verse 25. that there should be no schism in the body, the church, but that the members should have the same care one for another. So it is a privilege to be put in a position where we can be taken care of, where we can be admonished. Don't get, again, we shouldn't be offended. People have been livid with me at times because I've had to tell them, you're wrong. This is not right. You're wrong. And they can live it. That's an entirely wrong spirit. You're in a body of Christ, and one of the purposes of that is so that you can be admonished and reproved. So really, the members of a body of Christ ought to desire and even seek this admonishment. We ought to seek this admonishment. Seeking advice of the members of a body of Christ. Notice in Proverbs 15, verses 31 and 32. The ear that heareth the reproof of life abideth among the wise. He that refuseth instruction despiseth his own soul. Thinks lightly of his own soul. But he that heareth reproof getteth understanding. Solomon said in Proverbs 27, verse 6, faithful are the wounds of a friend. Sometimes admonishing can be painful to the one who is admonishing. It can be painful to the one being admonished. But faithful are the wounds of a friend. I have found out by experience, and you have too, I'm sure, that I have over and over and over again. You cease to be a friend when you tell people what they don't want to hear. They want nothing to do with you. Faithful are the wounds of a friend. So to be a member of a body is a wonderful thing. Then notice in Romans 16, we'll move on to the next thing. Romans 16, verse 16. There are several verses along this line. Salute one another with a holy kiss. The churches of Christ salute you. Notice in 1 Corinthians 16, verse 20. All the brethren greet you. Greet one another. There it is again, one another. Greet one another with an holy kiss. 2 Corinthians 13. 2 Corinthians 13. And verse 12. Greet one another with a holy kiss. 1 Peter chapter 5. 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 14. 1 Peter 5, verse 14. Greet ye one another with a kiss of charity. Each one of those has reference to the manner in which we are to greet one another. There in Romans 16 and 16, it is salute one another. It means we are to greet one another with expressions of kindness, courtesy, honor, and respect. That's how people are to be greeted. Not just visitors. I'm afraid many times that church members concern themselves more with greeting visitors than they do one another. That's wrong. Not that you're not to greet visitors, but we're to greet one another. Now the word kiss, of course, has reference to the custom of greeting at that time. But it conveys the idea of warmth and affection. We are to greet one another warmly. We are to greet one another with affection. Glad to see one another. You know how many miracles had to happen since Sunday to tonight for each one of us to be here? The miracles that God did in every one of our lives. And that ought to make us genuinely glad to see one another. Because Satan, from Sunday to tonight, was out to destroy us and was out to keep us from being here. But here we are. So I ought to be glad. I ought to be glad to see one another. It's salute one another, greet one another with a holy kiss. Now that speaks of the spirituality of the greeting. We read in 1 Peter 5 verse 14, greet ye one another with a kiss of charity. So we're not only to greet one another, we are to greet one another with honor. It's not just saying, hi, how you doing? And not listening to a word they say. It's greeting one another with honor, with respect, with warmth, with affection and love, and it's to be spiritual. It's not to be carnal. It's to be spiritual. This command, salute one another, greet one another, includes all personality types. Some are naturally more outgoing and friendly than others. And perhaps an individual's not outgoing. They don't have a tendency toward friendliness. That doesn't exclude them from greet one another. Doesn't exclude them. This command excludes no personality type. Well, it's just not like me to greet one another. Well, you need to change. You need to get over that. Because you're to do that. You're to greet one another. Now, it's a sad day when members of the same body of Christ greet others more warmly than they do their fellow church members. Something's wrong. Something's wrong. You're never going to convince me. It's very difficult to minister to others when you can't even greet them. Don't tell me, oh, I'll be there for them if you can't even greet them. No, that's not happening. So it's pretty difficult to minister to others if you cannot even greet them properly. Sometimes you have to work at greeting people. Sometimes it's a little more challenging. But you still have to do it. And you're to do it warmly because you should be glad that they're here. We must beware that we do not become so accustomed to one another that we don't greet one another. And don't come in the church building 1 minute before church service and then gripe because no one greeted you. Don't do that either. Seen that happen many times. Do not wait to be greeted. Well, it's just not me to greet them. If they come and greet me, then I'll greet them. No. Greet ye one another. So you don't wait to be greeted. You greet others. So we're to admonish one another. We're to greet one another. Then let's move on to the next one, Galatians chapter 6, very familiar verse. Verse 2. Well, verse 1 we've already read. If a man be overtaken in a fault. So that's the context here. Verse 2, bear ye one another's burdens, and so fulfill the law of Christ. Bear ye one another's burdens. What does that mean? Well, to bear means to carry. Carry one another's burdens. To bear means to absorb. Absorb one another's burdens. The word burdens has reference to a weight. So we are to carry the weights that other people have. We're to absorb those things. Has to do with a pressure. So it can be a weight, a pressure. But regardless, it is that which exhausts the strength and spirit of a person. Bear ye one another's burdens. That involves a willingness to take on someone else's weight, someone else's pressure, someone else's burden. It says, bear ye one another's burdens. Do you see anywhere in that verse where it says or even implies critique one another's burdens? That's what people are very good at. They critique. Well, they shouldn't be burdened about that. That's really not your concern. You're to bear the burden. Well, they're just imagining that burden. That may be so. But it's still a burden. If it can be a real burden, it can be an imagined one. It's still a burden either way. Bear ye one another's burdens. It's not critique one another's burdens. Weigh whether or not one's burdens are legitimate or not. Bear ye one another's burdens. How do we do that? Well, there's a lot of ways. But you cannot do it without sympathy. It has to be sympathy, empathy. You bear one another's burdens by assistance, by helping. Here's what a lot of people do. They help the way they want to help, but it's not help. It's not a help unless it's a help. Well, this is what I want to do, but that's not what's helping them. So you're not bearing their burdens. People do this all the time. Well, I'll help in this way. Well, they may not need your help in that way. Bear ye one another's burdens. Assist. You don't, in bearing burdens, you don't add to the burden. And many people do that. Job's friends. Good example. You do it by praying for one another. You do it by seeking to comfort one another, to encourage. Bear one another's burdens. And notice what it says, and so fulfill the law of Christ. Which takes us back to John 13:34. When Jesus said, a new commandment I give unto you, that ye love one another, even as I have also loved you, love one another. So it requires a heart of love. Now notice in Galatians 6, verse 5, for every man shall bear his own burden. Each one of us have a responsibility to bear one another's burdens. Each one of us has a responsibility to bear our own burdens. We're to bear our own burdens. Bear his own burden. While we're bearing our own burden, we're also to bear one another's burdens. That is, my burden does not excuse me from not bearing your burden. Well, I've got my own problems. What's your point? Bear your problems, bear your burdens, but bear ye one another's burdens. I'm telling you, if you have your own burdens and you bear someone else's burden, your burden is lightened. It actually is. It gives you a release. So just because we have our own burdens doesn't exempt us from bearing one another's burdens. So we must not become so consumed with our own burdens that we cannot be concerned with and bear the burdens of others. If you're so consumed with your own burden that you cannot think about someone else, you're too consumed with your own burden. You're too consumed with yourself. And again, try that sometime. When you're weighted down, just try bearing someone else's burden and see what happens. So a body of Christ is a place of burden bearing. And that's a great privilege. It's a great opportunity. It's a privilege, it's an opportunity to be a blessing to others. So many are concerned about being blessed, and our main concern needs to be about being a blessing to others. Bearing someone else's burdens is a good way that we do not become stuck in our own burdens. You want to know why a lot of people are stuck where they're stuck? Is because they don't think of anybody but themselves. A good way not to get stuck in your own burden is think of someone else's burden. And again, we must not add to a person's burden in attempting to bear their burden. There's a wonderful example, Jeremiah chapter 38. I've preached from this many times. Jeremiah 38, we're just going to look at it very quickly. But you can read the account in verses 4 through verse 13. Verse 6, we see that Jeremiah is cast into a dungeon. Verse 7, we read of a man by the name of Ebed-melech. And we're told that Ebed-melech heard that they had put Jeremiah in a dungeon. This man by the name of Ebed-melech knew the king. See the type. Knew the king. You hear of someone who has been put in an adverse circumstance. You know the king. You know the king. That makes you responsible. And in verse 8, we see that he went forth and spake to the king concerning Jeremiah. He's bearing Jeremiah's burden. In verse 9, he brought Jeremiah's situation before the king. He says, Jeremiah has been put in this dungeon and it's evil what they have done to him. Now you think about it, Ebed-melech had a position in the king's administration. He had his own personal matters to tend to. But when he heard that Jeremiah was put in the dungeon, he went forth and he spake to the king. The king instructed Ebed-melech in verse 10 what to do concerning Jeremiah. And there's a message there as well if you read on there. And in verses 11 and 12, Ebed-melech obeys. This is a beautiful picture of Galatians 6, verse 2. We are to bear one another's burdens as we would want them to bear our burdens. Not to wait for others to bear our burdens. If no one is bearing our burden, we have a responsibility to bear our own burden. That's always our responsibility. Don't wait for someone to bear your burden. You're to bear one another's burdens. Well, when I had a need, they weren't there for me, and I'm not about to help them. So they did wrong, and that justifies you doing wrong back. That's the world. That's not Christianity. That's the world. Next thing we see, forbear one another. We've mentioned this in the past. Ephesians chapter 4. Ephesians chapter 4. Verse 2. With all lowliness and meekness, with long suffering. So notice the requirements: lowliness, meekness, long suffering, forbearing one another in love. Galatians chapter 3, verses 12 and verse 13. Put on therefore as the elect of God, holy and beloved, bowels, and then notice what the qualifications now: mercies, kindness, humbleness of mind, meekness, long-suffering, forbearing one another, and forgiving one another, if any man have a quarrel against any, even as Christ forgave you, also do ye. Forbear one another. That is a declaration that a church, a body of Christ, is not perfect. If it were, you would not need to forbear one another. To forbear simply means to bear with one another. It's not always easy to bear with one another. In fact, some people you have to work pretty hard. Bear with one another. It means put up with one another. What are we willing to put up with? What are we willing to put up with from others? This would include, forbearing one another, would include the overlooking rather than the dwelling upon the faults and flaws of others. Anybody who's looking for faults in any person, you will find them. If you go looking, you will find them. If you go looking for flaws, you will find them. And if you dwell upon the faults and flaws of others, here's what happens. You begin to magnify them. They become worse than they really are. Forbearing one another does not dwell. We realize that, yes, everybody has faults. Everybody has flaws. Everybody has sin. But as much as possible, we overlook that. We don't dwell upon it. We don't dwell upon a person's faults. This person does this, and it just irritates me to no end, you might say. Well, you can't dwell on it. You can't dwell on that. And that's what it means to forbear. Again, the principle is, whatsoever ye would that men should do unto you, do even so to them. Every one of us want people to put up with us. We want them to put up with our bad moods. We want them to put up with our quirks. We want them to put up with whatever it is. Treat them as we want to be treated. You take, again, a body of Christ is a miracle. The Lord puts it all together, and He's the only one that can. And you look at all the temperaments in a body of Christ, the peculiarities, the habits, the dispositions of others. And then you add, so you just have those personality differences, temperance differences. And then you add to that sins, faults, and flaws. And if you're going to have any relationship whatsoever, forbearance is an absolute necessity in relating to others. Because if you think that you agree with somebody on everything, I've got news for you. You haven't talked to them about everything. Because no two people agree on everything. You have to be willing to overlook. Well, this person is wrong there. Perhaps that's so. But you can't dwell on it. It'll destroy a church. It'll destroy it. Now, some prerequisites to forbearance, of course, is lowliness, inward humility, meekness. Meekness is the result of inward humility. It has to do with our ability to receive injuries from others. Meekness. Moses was meek above all men. You think about Moses. You think about what he endured from the people. He was willing to receive the injuries of those people. He was meek. There are people today that are not willing to receive the slightest injury from others. The slightest mistreatment from others. So it basically is the opposite of ill will toward others. You cannot minister to others if you have ill will toward them. You cannot minister for their good if you want something bad to happen to them. You cannot possibly minister to them. So there has to be this meekness, this inward humility. And then again, this is in love. Which brings us to the next thing, which we're going to stop here because we go too long. But we see it there in Ephesians 4:32 and Colossians 3:13, and it's where we'll pick up next week, forgiving one another. So we see all of these things are included in ministry to others. And all of these things ought to be so obvious, so prevalent in a body of Christ. And wherever they are lacking, doesn't matter which one it is, it's indicative of more than one problem. Again, greet one another. Well, I can't greet that person. Well, that's indicative of a lot of problems. Not just one. That's indicative of a lot of things. So, minister to one another. We're all responsible. One person does not have all that responsibility upon them. They're not to be the greeter or whatever. It's a responsibility of every single member to minister to one another. Ben, if you'll come and lead us in verses